Regardless of the event, Princess Margaret never fails to captivate the public. However, a journalist uncovers a shocking secret during a ceremony. He witnesses the princess intimately brushing a piece of lint off a man's uniform. This man is not only a commoner but also a divorcee. Despite the gravity of the observation, the editor-in-chief dismisses it as a trivial matter. Insulted by the editor's dismissal, the reporter decides to demonstrate his point. He leans forward and suggestively strokes the editor's collar. The editor-in-chief is startled. The journalist explains that the act of dusting off lint is as intimate as a kiss, and he has a powerful intuition that this will become a major scandal. After some hesitation, the editor agrees to let the reporter draft the story before making a final decision. Meanwhile, Margaret calls her sister to invite her to dinner, specifically requesting that Elizabeth and Philip dress in their finest attire. During the meal, Margaret shyly confesses her secret romance with Peter and reveals her hope to marry him. Elizabeth is visibly stunned. She explains that as queen, she cannot simply grant her blessing, but as a sister, she is delighted to see Margaret find happiness. Overjoyed by her sister's support, Margaret impulsively kisses Elizabeth's cheek. The following morning, after reviewing the relevant legal documents, Elizabeth calls her sister to ask if she would be willing to move to Scotland with Peter to wed. She explains that while the Church of England forbids a divorced person from remarrying while a former spouse is still alive, the Church of Scotland does not have such strict regulations. Margaret is thrilled at the prospect of a church wedding and happily agrees to her sister's proposal. In another part of the city, a reporter for the Times is racing to finish the article on this explosive news. When the editor-in-chief sees the first draft, he is completely shocked. He realizes the story is significant, but he did not expect it to contain such intimate details. For the monarchy, which had only recently restored its reputation, this is a devastating blow. After careful consideration, the editor-in-chief seeks guidance from his superior. The superior is adamantly against publishing the story in the next day's paper. However, the editor argues that the press must not be a mere servant to the crown and that they must speak for themselves. Furthermore, he points out that even if they choose not to publish, other media outlets certainly will. Faced with this logic, the leader falls silent. Soon, a front-page article titled "Royal Love Shakes the Monarchy" appears in the Times. It acts like a triggered explosive. Before the blast, no one can predict the extent of the damage. Years ago, the scandal involving the Duke of Windsor and Mrs. Simpson nearly caused a constitutional crisis in Britain. Everyone wonders what kind of storm Margaret will bring to the royal family and if Queen Elizabeth can handle it. After Margaret and Peter's secret romance is exposed, the Queen Mother and Secretary Tommy Lascelles rush to meet Elizabeth to discuss a strategy. Elizabeth initially sides with her sister. However, the Queen Mother argues that the absolute priority must be protecting Elizabeth's position as queen. She notes that the marriage and abdication of Elizabeth's uncle nearly destroyed the crown's prestige. Tommy then explains the history of the Royal Marriages Act to Elizabeth. It originated with King George III, whose brothers married an illegitimate daughter and a common widow, respectively, infuriating the Church and Parliament. To calm the situation, the king had the act drafted to prevent young, inexperienced royals from marrying unsuitable partners. The law states that royals under the age of 25 must have the monarch's consent to marry, implying that after 25, permission may no longer be required. The Queen Mother proposes that if Margaret waits until she is 25, she can bypass the law without Elizabeth's direct intervention. This would preserve the Queen's relationship with the Church and the government. However, Margaret is currently only 23. For the next 2 years, she and Peter must wait and, ideally, remain apart. "This is the only solution, Your Majesty." When Elizabeth conveys this to her sister, Margaret is devastated. She pulls away, refusing to even hold Elizabeth's hand. Elizabeth agrees to let Margaret have a brief final meeting with Peter before he is stationed at the French embassy. However, to avoid further suspicion, she insists that Peter accompany her on a visit to Northern Ireland first. Upon landing, Elizabeth receives a warm welcome from the locals. She is accustomed to being the center of attention. However, as the television broadcasts focus heavily on interviews with Peter, Elizabeth becomes visibly displeased. This is the first time since her coronation that she has been overshadowed. Turn it off now. During dinner, Elizabeth confesses her frustration to Tommy. She brought Peter along to support her sister, but she did not anticipate the media's obsession with him. She feels her own presence has been ignored. Tommy suggests that Peter's transfer orders should take effect immediately. Elizabeth hesitates because she promised her sister a final meeting in London, and she hopes the situation will settle down after a day. Yet, even at a gala specifically prepared for the Queen, nearly half of the attention is focused on Peter. Over several days, wherever Peter goes, the crowds cheer for him. His popularity clearly surpasses that of the Queen. The situation worsens when, upon boarding the plane after the visit, the Queen waves and enters the cabin, but Peter lingers outside, waving enthusiastically to the crowd. This breach of protocol infuriates Elizabeth. She immediately orders Tommy to execute Peter's transfer. As soon as they land, Tommy and the staff solemnly inform Peter of the change. The plane to Brussels is waiting. You have 3 hours to pack your essentials. It may not be much time, but as a soldier, I expect efficient packing is second nature to you. Margaret, who is currently traveling abroad, is outraged when she receives the telegram regarding Peter's immediate departure. She demands to speak with her sister at once. Through the efforts of hundreds of operators, the phones throughout Buckingham Palace ring incessantly. They finally reach the Queen at the Sandringham stables. Margaret immediately berates her sister for breaking her promise, sharply suggesting that Elizabeth is acting out of spite because she and Peter stole the Queen's spotlight. Elizabeth tries to explain, but her sister refuses to listen. Since you won't protect me, I will no longer protect you. An eye for an eye, sister. The rift between the sisters is so severe that the operators who overheard the call are too frightened to breathe. 2 days later, news of the star-crossed lovers being forced apart by the palace appears on the front pages. Public opinion turns against the monarchy's perceived coldness, with some suggesting the Queen's treatment of her sister endangers the institution. The sudden criticism leaves Elizabeth bewildered. Meanwhile, after offering a few simple words of comfort, Philip leaves to spend time with his friends. Watching her husband drive away, Elizabeth feels like a prisoner within the palace walls. Margaret is free, while Elizabeth wonders what she has left besides her royal authority. It is revealed that the Queen's formal education was extremely limited. Because she frequently interacts with seasoned politicians, Elizabeth feels inadequate. She invites a renowned professor, hoping he can help her overcome this disadvantage. The professor asks to assess her current educational level. When asked if she has a high school diploma, Elizabeth stands there awkwardly. When asked about a middle school diploma, she looks down in embarrassment. No, were you taught by a governess to an equivalent level? I see. Elizabeth realizes she never received a formal education. Her childhood lessons in needlework and etiquette were only meant to mold her into a decorative princess. She feels ill-equipped to handle cunning politicians and confronts her mother about it. We taught you how to be a lady and a princess, why would you need a degree? No one wants a scholar as a monarch. They want a queen. The Queen Mother's response is disheartening. Elizabeth wants to contribute more to the nation than being a mere figurehead. The next day, Churchill informs her of a major international event: the Soviet Union has successfully tested an atomic bomb. This news hangs over the West like a sword. Churchill believes he should lead the peace efforts and announces that he is sending Vice Prime Minister Eden to Washington to prepare for a summit with President Eisenhower. Elizabeth expresses concern over Eden's health, as he has been ill lately. She hopes her ministers are fit enough to govern effectively. Churchill, fearing the Queen wants him to retire, insists that both he and Eden are in excellent health. However, Eden suffers a relapse on the flight to Washington and is forced to land in Chicago for emergency gallbladder surgery. Churchill calls him, hoping he will delay the surgery for the summit. Eden, who has long been annoyed by Churchill's arrogance, is not easily swayed by the Prime Minister's desperate plea. He insists that Churchill repeat himself so others can hear. I need you, Anthony. I need your judgment, your integrity, and your loyalty. Speak up. I need you by my side, Anthony. We both know I need you. But I must have this surgery, Winston. This is life or death. After Eden hangs up, the elderly Churchill, humiliated and stressed, suffers a stroke and becomes bedridden. Despite this, he intends to hide his condition from the Queen. I promised her the nation's leadership was in good health. I am a man of my word, Jock. His secretary, Jock, argues that he cannot keep this from her while governing in her name. Soon, Elizabeth is told that the Prime Minister has the flu and is asked to host Eisenhower at the palace in his place. The Queen is forced to cancel her plans to accommodate a state dinner. Eisenhower accepts the invitation. Churchill is reinvigorated by the news, momentarily forgetting his illness. He believes that if Eisenhower comes, he can lead once more. His wife pleads with him to remain calm. Why won't you face the fact that you are near death and tell the Queen the truth, Winston? After his excitement fades, Churchill suffers another stroke. Elizabeth also faces challenges in choosing her own staff. Her private secretary, Tommy, is retiring. She has two choices, the senior Michael Adine or the less experienced Martin Charteris. Traditionally, she should choose Michael, but she prefers Martin, who served her when she was a princess. She even privately offers him the job. However, days later, Martin regretfully informs her he cannot take the position. Elizabeth is confused by his sudden change of heart. After questioning him, Martin reveals that Tommy told him to decline. Elizabeth is furious. She feels she has sacrificed so much freedom for the crown, yet she cannot even choose a secretary. She confronts Tommy directly. I want to choose Martin as my private secretary. Tommy argues that this would be a mistake and lists the consequences of deviating from tradition. He cites the example of Edward VIII, whose minor personal preferences eventually led to the abdication crisis. A breach in the dam starts with a small crack, any mistake can lead to disaster. His logic leaves Elizabeth conflicted. She decides to consult the Prime Minister's secretary, Jock, who previously worked for her. She hopes he will understand her feelings. However, Jock is consumed by guilt for hiding Churchill's condition. Before the Queen can even bring up the secretary issue, he confesses that Churchill has suffered 2 strokes. I see. Is this why you called me here? No, I called you to discuss whether I should appoint Michael Adine as my secretary. Not Martin Charteris. But what you just said is much more important. Elizabeth is angry and discusses the deception with her private tutor. When the tutor asks how she intends to handle it, she is silent. She feels she cannot scold these elite men because they are more educated and talented than she is. The professor points out that this is about principle, not education. Their actions violated the Constitution, and no one understands the Constitution better than she does. It turns out Elizabeth was indeed educated. Since age 7, she was tutored by the vice provost of Eton College. The focus of her studies was the British Constitution. At the time, her tutor explained the 2 elements of the Constitution, the dignified and the efficient. The monarch represents the dignified part and is accountable only to God. The government represents the efficient branch, it is accountable to the electorate. Only when both elements cooperate and trust one another can the system function at its peak. At that time, Elizabeth, though she only half understood, took careful notes on the word trust. What do you think I should do? Summon them and scold them like children? Soon after, Elizabeth ordered her servants to search all the royal estates, determined to find the red notebook from her childhood. Under the meticulous inspection of the palace guards, it was eventually discovered in an old wooden chest. The atmosphere of tension and anxiety gradually thickened. Prime Minister Churchill and Lord Salisbury were summoned to Buckingham Palace. The scene of the young Queen reprimanding veteran statesmen was about to unfold. Shedding her usual friendly demeanor, Elizabeth used stern language to point out that Bob's behavior had obstructed and interfered with her authority as Queen. In medieval times, this would have been considered high treason. Elizabeth's well-reasoned criticism left Bob speechless, and she had no intention of allowing the old statesman to explain himself. You may go. Watching Bob walk out of the hall in a daze, Churchill, who was already tense, became even more restless. Facing this immensely influential World War II hero, Elizabeth did not use a harsh tone. Instead, she used the gentlest words to accuse Churchill of actions over the past weeks that betrayed not only the national constitution but also the friendship between them. Confronted with this dual legal and moral indictment, Churchill looked like a schoolboy who had made a mistake, wearing a crestfallen expression and not daring to breathe heavily, only able to secretly wipe a tear from the corner of his eye. Elizabeth took out that red notebook, turned to the page she had noted, and read to Churchill word for word what she had learned, pointing out that his behavior had broken this trust. This was not just irresponsible, it could even have serious consequences for national security. Then, Elizabeth shifted to ask if the Prime Minister's health had improved at all. Receiving an affirmative answer, she asked again if, given his current health status, he could handle his present duties. Before Churchill could reply, Elizabeth spoke quickly. "I hope you can think carefully about your answer for the sake of respect for my position and responsibility, rather than answering arbitrarily because of my age or gender." Despite being criticized, Churchill was very satisfied because he saw that Elizabeth now fully possessed everything a queen needed, and he had also fulfilled his promise to her father. Returning to the bedroom, Elizabeth saw Philip, who was rarely home, and Philip also noticed his wife's unusual aura today. The feeling was hard to describe. He simply felt his wife seemed more beautiful today, and perhaps even taller. Elizabeth had no time to play with Philip because she was about to meet her new secretary. However, Philip had his own way of keeping his wife there. "If you don't stay with me, what will you do?" "There are two choices. Either I have to find something to stand on to reach my tall beauty, or she can get down on her knees." Soon, the Queen's new secretary received notice to arrive the next day. To prove to the world that it was still powerful, the British royal family prepared 100 ultra-luxurious outfits and a fleet of cruisers for the Queen to tour the world, restoring the prestige of the empire on which the sun never sets. However, Philip, the empire's son-in-law, saw through it all. He sharply pointed out that the government's action was nothing more than painting a thin layer over a rusty old car, hoping to convince the public it still worked well. But the truth was that rust had corroded the engine and the entire structure. This dilapidated car was disintegrating in an irreversible trend. Just as the Queen stepped onto the plane, the Prime Minister rushed over. He knew that since the end of World War II, Britain's influence in the world had gradually weakened. And this world tour by the Queen was undoubtedly of vital importance for maintaining British imperial rule and strengthening the Commonwealth. He warned Elizabeth not to let the public see the Queen's exhausted face, nor let them see that the crown is also a burden. "Let them look at you, but only show them the immortality of the monarchy." Elizabeth smiled and thanked Churchill for the reminder, but as she turned away, an immense pressure seemed to rise in her chest, weighing so heavily she could hardly breathe. During the Queen's diplomatic activities, all domestic award ceremonies and speeches were handled by the Queen Mother. However, the Queen Mother, falling ill due to her longing for King George VI, proposed going to northern Scotland to relax and relieve her sorrow. She suggested transferring these duties to Princess Margaret. After all, the princess was currently separated from her lover, having extra work might help lift her spirits. However, she did not expect that her youngest daughter was inherently arrogant and willful. At a dinner party hosting foreign envoys, Margaret did not follow the government's prepared speech but instead performed an impromptu royal talk show. "Our ambassador to the U.S., Sir Roger Makins, is the only upright man in Washington. Of course, there is also Mr. Slypay of Greece and his wife. Greece has given us many good things, philosophy, democracy, and my brother-in-law. Prince Philip is a Greek prince." Margaret's speech made everyone laugh out loud and received thunderous applause. She seemed to thoroughly enjoy the feeling of being cheered, later calling Peter to brag that she had been better at socializing than her sister since childhood. She believed that if she were the Queen, she would certainly be hailed by everyone. However, she still did not understand the price a true queen must pay. Elizabeth's schedule was incredibly dense. She not only had to visit 57 towns in Australia in 58 days, but she also had to participate in different activities every day. There were even only 8 minutes between each activity for the Queen to change her outfit. Philip complained that this was not a diplomatic visit at all but more like a touring performance. He only hoped to arrange more time each day to use the bathroom, but even such a small request was rejected. "It is unlikely, Your Majesty. Wake up at 4:30 a.m., fly to Jamaica at 6 a.m. Elizabeth read the news about her sister's warm welcome in London in the newspapers. She was slightly worried that Margaret would overshadow her in the future. Philip suggested reducing some of the schedule and returning home early, but Elizabeth refused. "The plan cannot change. Nothing is to be cancelled." She could not harm the national interest for her personal benefit. At that time, the southern hemisphere was in the sweltering heat of summer, and the crowds on both sides of the road stretched for 10 miles. To reduce the time the Queen spent in the sun, the secretary suggested increasing the speed of the car. But considering that the royal horses behind might not keep up, Elizabeth rejected the proposal. Flags fluttered, and the noise of the crowd was loud. Elizabeth forced a smile to display the immortality of the monarchy to the world. But at this moment, under the camera flashes, the silk ribbons flying through the air looked like white funeral shrouds. The Queen and the Prince were like the walking dead, with only their shells remaining. In the flow of the times, no matter how hard they tried, they could not change the fact that the monarchy had declined. Due to maintaining a smile for a long time at high intensity, Elizabeth suffered temporary facial muscle spasms. The doctor advised the Queen to stop smiling immediately. However, Elizabeth said she had another banquet to preside over tonight and hoped the doctor could think of another way. With no other choice, the doctor decided to use a sedative injection to reduce muscle fatigue. Earlier, Philip had complained to his wife that the entire diplomatic visit was like a humorous and ridiculous circus. He didn't understand why his wife took every activity so seriously. Was it just to maintain the image of a good girl in her father's eyes? What do you want to hear from his mouth? Lilibet did a wonderful job. She handled all the parades with ease. Lilibet never lets anyone down. She is always so thoughtful. In the end, he loved her more than you. Get out. Get out. George VI's favoritism toward Margaret was always a painful, unhealed wound in Elizabeth's heart. The normally gentle Queen finally couldn't hold back her anger at this moment. Indeed, only those closest to us can deliver the most painful stabs. Elizabeth screamed as she chased Philip out, but accidentally ran into a crowd of reporters waiting for an interview with cameras. It was over, all the days of trying to build the Queen's image were ruined. Elizabeth didn't dare think carefully about the consequences if this were exposed. After a moment of thought, she decided to speak to the reporters herself. Elizabeth apologized to the reporters for the minor incident. "I believe every marriage goes through these things, and even the royal family is no exception." She even proactively asked if they needed her to cooperate for an interview. Fortunately, this was a reporter with a conscience. He did not threaten or blackmail her, but quietly took the roll of film out of the camera and gave it to the Queen as a gift. Elizabeth was very moved by this. In contrast, Princess Margaret in London was visiting a coal mine by invitation. When interviewed by the media, Margaret's vivid and humorous language made the audience laugh. When the reporter asked who she would give this commemorative piece of coal to, Margaret said she had a special person chosen in her heart. Everyone who liked reading tabloids knew it was Group Captain Peter Townsend, who had been sent away by the Queen. The reporter asked if the princess missed Peter. "Yes. I miss him very much." "Then do you miss your sister, the Queen?" "No. Not nearly as much." All the onlookers turned their eyes toward Peter. Peter could only respond with a forced smile. Even Peter knew that Margaret's public mockery of her sister was wrong. Their relationship was already being obstructed by the royal family. This would only make the royal family more resentful. Sure enough, Prime Minister Churchill soon sought out Margaret. Considering the princess's recent outrageous behavior, Churchill decided that the remaining royal activities would be represented by the Queen Mother. Even though the Queen Mother was far away in Scotland, Churchill sent someone to bring her back. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's months-long diplomatic visit was finally nearing its end. However, the final stop, Gibraltar, had the most dangerous security issues. Due to the rise of the independence movement, the main local political party leaders had all received death threats. Statements claimed that the British Queen setting foot on Gibraltar was like stepping into a grave. No one could be sure if this trip was safe. Philip did not want to be treated like a sitting duck and hurriedly wanted to flee, suggesting they cancel the itinerary and return to London immediately. However, Elizabeth believed that fleeing during a battle would only make them look cowardly and disappoint the local people. More importantly, she wanted to prove to those who thought they could do better than her that she was the true chosen one. Natural leaders with steadfast characters and personal charisma might be better suited to appear before the public and lead history. But for better or worse, the crown has landed on my head. If I say we go, we go. The Queen of England braved the life-threatening danger, sailing the royal yacht into Gibraltar. This news received great praise from the monarchists. Over 40,000 miles of travel by sea, land, and air, with a grand guest list, Queen Elizabeth did not miss a single detail. Thousands upon thousands of people witnessed the Queen's grace firsthand. This great diplomatic trip strengthened and made the Commonwealth more prosperous and was called the beginning of a new Elizabethan age by the media. However, Elizabeth, who had just returned home and had not yet enjoyed the joy of motherhood, received an invitation to meet the Prime Minister. He reported to the Queen about Princess Margaret's series of rule-breaking behaviors. My sister? Yes. So, what do you want me to do? Princess Margaret, as the most rebellious and willful princess in British history, was indeed loved by everyone. She was pampered by her father, King George VI, since childhood, and later greatly indulged by her sister, the Queen. This younger sister, for years junior to Elizabeth, should have always walked behind her sister in terms of status, yet she was the one most praised by their father. Because Elizabeth was the future queen, King George VI was very strict with her. As for Margaret, it could be said he overindulged her. King George VI once said, "Elizabeth is my pride, and Margaret is my joy." Therefore, the question of who was the favorite daughter was always a thorn in Elizabeth's side. Due to different educational methods, the two sisters grew up with completely different personalities. The elder sister, Elizabeth, was more mature and stable, while the younger sister, Margaret, was more unrestrained and reckless. After becoming queen, Elizabeth always loved her sister very much. But Margaret, with her flamboyant and willful personality, frequently caused trouble for her sister. Previously, because Margaret loved Group Captain Peter, a divorced man, and was blocked by both Parliament and the Church, the two sisters had experienced conflict. Now, Elizabeth had just ended a 6-month diplomatic tour. The first thing she received upon returning to London was the Prime Minister's accusation against Margaret. It turned out that during the Queen's absence, Margaret, as a royal representative, was required to attend several important occasions. But Margaret, always arrogant and willful, repeatedly danced in forbidden zones, either making a rising young singer cry or refusing to meet important envoys. My sister? Yes. Elizabeth felt she needed to have a talk with her sister. Margaret initially thought this was just a normal conversation between sisters, but when the servant led her to the meeting room, she realized her sister was summoning her to the palace in the capacity of the monarch. As soon as they met, the empty room began to reek of gunpowder. Elizabeth hoped her sister would pay attention to her words and deeds from now on and stop acting arbitrarily. "This is my personality and vitality," Margaret said. Elizabeth considered these to be unstable elements and a farce. Margaret countered that her sister was the one without a personality. Elizabeth did not want to engage in a meaningless argument. She demanded her sister apologize to the people she had offended. However, Margaret did not take this to heart. Actually, before Elizabeth went on her trip, she had reminded Margaret, "When I am away, don't forget who you are replacing. My characterless sister." The Queen of England is not a promotional model. But Margaret was still bitter because her sister had sent her boyfriend Peter abroad. Combined with her inherent rebellious nature, causing trouble was predictable. Your rules are clear. You just need to follow the rules. Margaret, you are free. You just need to enjoy your freedom. Do you think I am free? The two sisters, envying and admiring each other, both believed the other was in paradise. At this moment, Margaret recalled their father's saying, "I remember that Elizabeth is my pride, and Margaret is my joy." Margaret emphasized that she was the daughter her father loved most. She believed this was the only point where she surpassed her sister. A hint of loss could be seen on Elizabeth's face. As a daughter, how could she not wish she were also favored by her father? Eventually, Margaret agreed to her sister's request. She would appear to apologize, but she hoped her sister would allow her to make a small mistake occasionally. That way, under her sister's aura, her own flaws would not be so prominent. Looking at her naive sister, Elizabeth, though helpless, also felt pity. However, the test of the sisters' relationship had not yet ended. Margaret's boyfriend, Peter, was about to finish his term and return home. 2 years ago, Elizabeth had promised her sister that once Peter returned, they would no longer be bound by the royal family regarding their marriage. But would things really be that simple? Margaret was eventually willing to leave the royal family to marry Peter. Would the Queen truly agree? Just as long as you don't sit on him too quickly. The Queen of the British Empire was insulted by her husband in front of everyone. Just because Elizabeth provided a private phone line for her horse racing manager, Philip turned red with jealousy, even daring to insult the Queen publicly. But every time Philip went out with friends late at night and didn't come home, leaving Elizabeth alone in her room, did he ever think about his wife's feelings? Although Elizabeth is the Queen, there are too many things she must comply with. She cannot fly planes or host parties as freely as Philip. Horse racing is one of the few things Elizabeth loves and can do. Unfortunately, Philip has no interest in horses. The horse manager, Portia, was Elizabeth's childhood friend. The two families had a close relationship for a long time. At first, many advised Elizabeth to marry Portia, but Elizabeth only had eyes for Philip. Between two people who shared common interests and were childhood friends, they indeed appeared more intimate than ordinary friends. Margaret noticed Philip's mood swings and reminded her sister about this. But Elizabeth always held on to her principle of a clear conscience and didn't mind the matter. The Queen's warhorse, Oriole, won the championship at the Guinness competition and received an invitation to the Laurel International Cup. However, Portia advised the Queen to withdraw from the competition, suggesting she retire the champion horse while he was at his peak to earn high stud fees instead. A stud? Yes, it was a viable choice. So, what is the annual yield? Approximately £16,000 per year. Not bad at all. To facilitate discussions regarding Oriole's new career, Elizabeth even installed a dedicated telephone line for Portia. However, arranging matches for horses was no simple feat given it was Oriole's debut. Elizabeth was determined that no mistakes be made in the process. To produce the perfect offspring, Portia handpicked 3 exceptional maras for Elizabeth's consideration. After a thorough comparison, they settled on a black champion of pure lineage. The two champions bonded instantly and wasted no time getting to work. Upon witnessing Oriole's performance, Elizabeth was deeply satisfied and grew even more appreciative of Portia, who served as both her racing manager and close confidant. Philip had long been resentful of this man. Now, not only did Portia have a private line to his wife, but the two appeared to be exchanging flirtatious glances right under his nose. Unable to take it any more, Philip hurled a vulgar insult to provoke Elizabeth. Hearing such offensive language, Elizabeth did not retaliate immediately. Instead, she waited until they were back in the car for the couple to have a genuine blowout. "Philip, you are being completely irrational." He slammed the door in a rage and walked away. That evening, before attending a formal gala, Elizabeth spoke to Philip with tearful eyes and a steady gaze. "I have absolutely nothing to hide from you. Nothing at all. Portia is merely my friend. It is true that many hoped I would marry him, believing such a union would have been far easier and perhaps more suitable than ours. But to everyone's disappointment, I have never loved anyone but you. Do you dare to look me in the eye and say the same?" Do you? Whether Philip dared to answer remains unknown, but in reality, reports of his extramarital affairs were countless. Even as he approached 70, rumors of him dating rising stars continued to surface. In the face of this, Elizabeth always chose to trust her husband. Whether for the sake of the monarchy or not, Elizabeth remained faithful to a one life, one soulmate philosophy from start to finish. What could have caused Churchill to fly into a rage on his 80th birthday, only to be left cowering in a corner, speechless, after being scolded by an unknown person? Not long ago, the British Parliament had specially commissioned a famous modern artist to paint an 80th birthday portrait for the Prime Minister. The artist was a successful young genius named Graham Sutherland. He was also a devoted admirer of World War II heroes like Churchill. However, as an artist, Sutherland held uncompromising principles regarding his style. Although Churchill insisted the painting didn't need to be overly realistic, aiming instead to project his authority as Prime Minister, Sutherland remained firm, only through accuracy could there be truth. When the first sketch was finished, Churchill asked to see it, but Sutherland refused immediately. He did not want his creative process disturbed by any subjective influences. Churchill could only reiterate his point. "You must realize that you are not merely painting me. You are painting the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, and everything that his great government stands for, including democracy and freedom. You are painting the ultimate symbol of leadership and governance. Remember that." As is well known, Churchill was not just a politician and writer, but also an amateur painting enthusiast. Sharing this hobby, the two men had quietly studied each other's work. As a professional, Sutherland greatly admired Churchill's painting of a goldfish pond. In the peaceful, rippling water, he saw a profound sorrow etched into the soul of the creator. It turned out that when Churchill painted that piece, it marked exactly 1 year since the death of his youngest daughter. Similarly, Churchill was deeply moved by Sutherland's pastoral. That piece had been composed shortly after Sutherland's own 2-month-old son had passed away. "Oh dear, I am so sorry." "Thank you." This shared experience of loss caused the two men to cherish their friendship even more. Soon, Churchill's birthday arrived. He first blew out his candles amidst the singing and well-wishes of family and friends. Later, he traveled to Westminster Abbey. Churchill was the first and only national leader in British history to celebrate a birthday at the Abbey. Both the Queen and the Queen Mother watched the Prime Minister's birthday broadcast on television. Even on such a solemn occasion, Churchill did not miss the chance for political theatre. Previously, many had advised Churchill to resign and retire, but the Prime Minister had personally rejected them all. Churchill remarked that while it was the perfect moment to step down, he had unfortunately forgotten his lines. Therefore, he chose to perform one more act rather than end it there. "Good heavens, he's teasing us." After the laughter subsided, Churchill unveiled the portrait he had long anticipated. However, as the painting was fully revealed, Churchill's face became as grim as if he had swallowed something foul. Although the veteran politician immediately masked his anger with mockery, Elizabeth, watching the screen, could see the Prime Minister's internal dissatisfaction. His murderous gaze was impossible to hide. Immediately after the ceremony, Sutherland sought out Churchill. Churchill could not accept appearing before the public in such a manner. He branded Sutherland a traitor who wielded a brush of death. He felt what the artist had done was a total betrayal of their friendship. Sutherland urged Churchill not to overreact and to slowly accept it, as this was his true image. He argued he hadn't exaggerated anything. In fact, he had shown the work to Churchill's wife during the process, and she found it very lifelike. "This is not my true likeness. It is the truth. No, this is cruel. Time is inherently merciless. If you see aging, it is because you are growing old. If you see frailty, it is because you are truly weak. There is nothing more heart-wrenching in this world than a hero in his twilight years or a beauty losing her luster." Sutherland's remark about the ruthlessness of time shattered the illusion Churchill had painstakingly maintained. Perhaps it was finally time to let go. In front of Buckingham Palace, an old man with a cane stepped out of his car, limping slightly. This was Churchill's final meeting with the Queen as Prime Minister. It came as no surprise, Elizabeth knew this day would come. She did not ask him to stay but, on behalf of all citizens, offered her sincerest gratitude to him. After the handover was complete, Churchill did not follow the traditional etiquette of kissing her hand. Instead, like a loving elder, he kissed Elizabeth on the forehead. A historical figure who had dominated the political landscape officially exited the stage. 10 years later, Churchill passed away from a stroke. The British government held a state funeral with the highest honours to bid him farewell. Churchill's wife, Clementine, eventually burned the portrait that posterity would call a masterpiece, despite how much Churchill loathed it during his life. As soon as Churchill left office, Britain faced a severe diplomatic crisis. The new Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, visited Egypt, but the trip resulted in a clash with President Nasser during a banquet. The friction began because Nasser and his entourage arrived at the dinner in military uniforms. Typically, for such diplomatic events, suits or formal attire are worn to minimize tension. Eden, attempting to be sympathetic about the wardrobe mismatch, spoke deliberately in Arabic. "If I were as honored as you, I would certainly wear my uniform at all times and never take it off." However, the reality was that Eden had shown great courage and earned many decorations during World War I. The honors on his own uniform far outshone Nasser's. Nasser perceived Eden's comment as a deliberate insult. The Egyptian media amplified the incident, claiming the British Prime Minister was arrogant and disrespectful, intentionally humiliating President Nasser. Elizabeth believed that showing goodwill at this moment could help repair the relationship between Britain and Egypt. However, she had an even more pressing matter when she summoned Eden. Elizabeth had previously promised her sister that she could marry Peter in 2 years. Now, Peter had returned from abroad, and Margaret had passed her 25th birthday. Under the Royal Marriages Act, she should have been free to choose her spouse. But the reality was that the marriage required the unanimous consent of both Houses of Parliament, followed by a 1-year waiting period before the wedding could take place. What? Elizabeth was stunned. No one had informed her of this at the time. To uphold her promise to her sister, Elizabeth asked Eden to use his influence to push for Parliament's approval. Later, Margaret asked her sister, "Can I start preparing for the wedding?" Elizabeth didn't know how to break the news and could only tell her sister that they still had to wait a little longer. This concludes the film. Thank you for watching. Please leave a comment below to let me know which movie you'd like to see next. Goodbye, and see you again.